In the last module, we really provided you an overview of a lot of the different elements that are involved in actually deploying the field service solution to your organization. There's many different components inside the actual application that will help support your implementation and make it much more effective. For example, products and service. When a work order is created, there might be products and or services that you need to attach to that work order. If so, how are you going to calculate pricing? Is pricing going to be calculated based upon who we're actually delivering that service to? Is pricing going to be based upon the work order itself? How are you going to handle designating price lists within the application? How are you marking up your products and services? If you're offering a specific product to a customer, how are you handling the markup within the application? Is it a percentage? Is it a fixed dollar amount? What happens if that technician is going out and providing this service after normal working hours? Maybe they're scheduled to work on a holiday. These are all things that you want to consider as part of that. You also might want to look at things as far as how you're going to identify who is that most qualified person. How are you going to reflect those qualifications on the scheduling board? So a lot of these individual items can really be configured as part of the application. And so in this module, what we want to do is we want to look at some of the different configuration settings that are available. First and foremost, we're going to talk real briefly about some of the different security roles that ship as part of field service and the implementation when you first roll out the solution. We're also going to talk about some of the initial configuration settings. This is going to include things like, how are you going to handle, addressing and geocoding of information on the scheduling board to make sure that people are in the appropriate areas? How are you going to define the territories that you service inside the field service implementation to make scheduling and finding resources available to work with those individual items? How are you going to set up your price lists and your product catalogs to reflect what it is that you're going to try to accomplish from a field service perspective? How are you going to handle pricing markups? How are you going to handle work order creation and work order statuses? These are all some of the initial configuration options that we're going to look at. We'll also talk more in depth about the products and the price lists, and we'll also talk quite a bit about the actual resources and showing you how to define those individualized resources inside the application as well. One of the first considerations that you have to think about from your implementation perspective is who's going to be doing what inside the actual deployment and the actual implementation of the application. To make that process a little bit easier, the field service solution actually ships with 5 different security roles. Now, these security roles are there for you to use kind of out of the box, or again, just like any security role inside the application, you can modify them to fit your specific needs. First and foremost, you'll have your field service administrator, a person who's going to be responsible for setting up work or setting up some of your administrative settings, defining work order types, defining booking status information. Really, the person who's really going to be responsible for administrating the field service solution as a whole. People who need application access, so just access to the application, but maybe are not necessarily, are going to be going out and doing some individual situations. Who are your dispatchers? The people who will need to be able to go into the schedule board and be able to locate specific resources and then define who those individual people are and assign them. Who are the people that are going to handle your inventory capabilities and be purchasing inventory and handling returns and purchase orders? And then obviously also you'll have your field service resources. These would be people who are going to be technicians out in the field who will be actually servicing some of your individual customers. All of these information or all these security roles have some predetermined information that you can use. But just like anything, they do need to be mapped back to individual Dynamics 365 users so you can work with it. Now, the next piece to this is the actual administrative settings. So one of the key things that you need to look at is how are you going to initially configure this? Now, we're going to get into work orders in the next module and really talk about work orders as a whole, but there's like a lot of key elements and components that make up this field service implementation. These would include things like the territories that you service, the priorities for cases, or for work orders. When a work order gets created, what are the priority levels that are going to be assigned to that? Where do you locate your inventory? Where are these service technicians coming out from a warehouse perspective? A warehouse could be a physical location that you might have, or it might be a truck that contains inventory items. So now if we want to look at stock levels that are on specific trucks or pieces of equipment, we could do that as part of the administrative settings. Price lists. payment types, incident types, tax codes. These are all different things that obviously are going to have some type of effect in how you're moving forward from a field service implementation standpoint. And so the next thing I want to do is really dive into each one of these individual areas and show you just where they come into play from an administrative perspective inside the application. Using Dynamics 365's new kind of app module navigation, there's a few different ways that you can actually get to the field service capabilities inside the application. First and foremost, if you go up to your Dynamics 365 menu and you click on it, you'll see that you have several different options listed over into here based upon what specific modules you've chosen to implement as part of your deployment. One of the options that you'll see in here is Dynamics 365 Field Service, which will take you to the main field service area within the application itself. Once you're in that field service area, now you can start navigating through some of the individualized elements. So this is where you're going to see, obviously, as we showed you earlier, the work orders and the scheduling board and some of the different items that would work through this. But one of the items that you're going to see inside field service is administration. And so underneath the settings area of field service and administration, this is where you're going to really do a lot of the administrative capabilities of the application itself. And one of the first items that you're going to see inside the field service settings is just your generalized field service settings or individual items. These are going to have all of the items that are going to be associated with the different elements that you're going to deploy or could potentially deploy as part of your organization. So for example, the first option that you see in here is directly around work orders and handling bookings. So from a work order perspective, do you have a starting number that you want to use for your work order? So when work orders are generated, what's the starting number that you want to use? So in this case, maybe we want to use 2500. Do you have a specific prefix for those items when you're working through it? When somebody goes through and actually completes a work order, what's the default status that you want to define for those work order completion status? How do you want to handle work order invoice creation? So you can have invoices either kind of be created manually, or you can have invoices be created on the fly. So when a work order status changes from open to actually posted, we could actually have the system go through and generate that information from there. When you start talking about bookings and working through things, the bookings are the actual item that is being scheduled out and defined for that individual person. So once I close a work order, do I want to deactivate, the work order within the system itself? Keep in mind that work order records are actually regular CRM records that have your status of active and inactive. They don't necessarily become deactivated just by changing the status of a workflow. So this is what allows to trigger some of the workflow functionality and plugin functionality that runs behind the scenes to auto deactivate some of this information when you complete a booking or when you complete a specific work order within the application itself. As you're working through things, we'll talk a little bit more about pay types, but when you start talking about resources, there's different pay types that you can define. So for example, if somebody is going out and they're performing work when businesses are closed or on a holiday, what does that pay type look like? Do you have minimum travel charges? And now how are you calculating travel expenses? Overtime pay? Do we have things for break pay? These are all things that you can configure as part of the application to really set up some of the default options that you're working with. Same thing with like agreements and purchasing and individual items. These are just some of your baseline functionality that allows you to tweak some of the system defaults that are going to control overall what happens inside the application when you're working through it. So this is one of the first areas that you're going to go in and kind of define your settings for as part of your field service implementation. Now the next aspect to this that we talked a little bit about is some of these other individual elements. And now as we go through and we start building work orders and we start creating some of these individual situations, we'll get into some of these individual items just because they tie into what it is that we're trying to accomplish. But let's hit some of the key aspects that you would be looking at first and foremost inside your organization. So the first one would really be kind of your territorial option. Your territories are going to obviously represent specific regional areas that you might service inside your application. So for example, as an organization, you may service all of North America, but you may have different regional territories for North America based upon where your physical locations are. Maybe you have kind of a North American, or maybe you have kind of a West Central regional area, maybe you have a West regional area, a Southern Central regional area. These would be the different territories that you can define. Now, what's nice about these territories is these territories can actually be associated with the accounts that you service inside field service. And by associating those territories with those accounts, you can now have those territories get auto-populated into some of the work orders. So again, when you have territories associated with resources, you can make sure that you have the appropriate resource from that standpoint. Now, because we want to keep everything simplistic and everything within the state of Washington, we actually within our sample data only have one territory, but this gives you an idea as to what you might be able to accomplish if you wanted to do additional territories inside the application. You can click on New, it'll open up your territory screen. You basically define the territory option that you want to work with within the application. What do you want to call this? Maybe we'll just call this Texas from a territory perspective. We'll assign our manager inside the territory itself, and then we can go ahead and hit save and close. And then as we're going through this, we can now start to assign individual areas and individual people to these territories as part of the application. Now, the other thing that's kind of neat with these territories is if I scroll down into here, there's a postal code option. So one of the things that you can do is if you have, a lot of postal codes that you service, all of those postal codes are obviously going to be associated with specific territories inside your organization. This is where you can go in and you can specify what specific postal codes you use and what territory those postal codes should be associated with. So when it sees those postal codes on things like accounts and work orders, it knows that it should automatically associate that specific item with this particular territory because that's where we've defined that information as part of the application. And so this makes it much easier from you from an application perspective to be able to really go out and start handling some of those automated processes around scheduling and dispatching things. Another area that you'll see, and then we'll get into some of the other stuff here, would be your characteristics. So characteristics are skill sets that people have of your organization. So you could have somebody who is a .NET programmer. You could have somebody who needs to have specific access to a building. You could have somebody who has a specific skill set around an application. These are items that can now be associated with specific work orders. And so from a scheduling perspective, you now have the ability to go out when you're creating and working with these work orders to associate it with specific characteristics to find people who fit those methodologies. Now, what's neat about these characteristics is you also have the capabilities within these characteristics to define, specific proficiency models. So when you're associating a resource with a characteristic, you can associate them with how proficient they are with that specific skill set or characteristic. So from a CRM perspective, I'm extremely proficient from that standpoint, but maybe from a HTML perspective, I'm kind of borderline proficient. This now allows me to define what those processes look like and give me a more detailed situations as we're moving forward. So these administrative areas, and again, we'll get into many more of these as we move through it, but these administrative areas are key areas that you're going to set up and define as part of your application when you're moving forward. We mentioned this a little bit at the top of the module, but products and services really play a key factor in any type of field service implementation. And when we talk about a product and service, we're really talking about what it is that you sell. It could be something that is a specific part or a product that you sell. It could be a service. It could be a service that you use to perform preventative maintenance. It could be a service that you use just for standard kind of break fix functionality. All of this information ultimately needs to get billed back to the customer somehow when you associate that information with a work order. And so that's what's kind of nice about products and services from within a Dynamics 365 field service capability. You do have the capabilities to add these product and services to work orders. Now, what's kind of cool is there's really a couple of different ways that you can handle it. If you want to, you can just manually go in when you create a work order and you can say, here's the products and or services that I want to associate with this specific work order in the system. The other option that you can do is you can actually go in and you can automatically have them added to the work order using what are called incident types. So you can associate them as specific incident types within the application, and those incident types can have products automatically kind of pre-added. So if you think about it from like a templated perspective, if you have a lot of common issues that are commonly reported, you now have the capabilities to use that information when you're moving forward. Now, when you start talking about products and services, there's a few different types of categories that are associated with them. So from a field perspective, a field service perspective, it really boils down into 3 different items. It's an inventory item. And now think of an inventory item as kind of big ticket items. So this might be things like, a physical printer or some type of, computer or refrigerator or a piece of equipment that you are going to be selling to your customer, and that's typically going to be deducted from inventory within that standpoint. So anything that's really an inventory-based item that you need to keep track of how many you have on hand and quantities from an application standpoint. A non-inventory standpoint are going to be things that are sold but not necessarily tracked inside inventory. So, maybe you needed just a network cable and you don't necessarily keep an entire running tally of those network cables, or maybe you needed, something small in order to be able to facilitate that. That would be what you would consider kind of a non-inventory item inside the application. And then finally, you have your services. So when you are defining your products inside your product catalog, you're going to define them as either one of those 3 options. And your services are exactly what they would sound like. It's some type of typical service that you're going to provide to your customer. And typically when you're doing services, those services are really going to be sold on more of a time and material basis. And they're going to have list price and they're going to have costs that are really defined based upon hourly rates, because that specific service will have some type of hourly rate associated with them. Now, when you start going out and actually, conducting these services, and you actually have people going out and working on these work orders, you can have them calculate kind of the duration of the service a couple of different ways. When the field agent is out on the mobile application, they can kind of enter in the duration of the service, so the start time and the end time based upon when they were out in that individual situation. Or it can actually look at the elapsed time on the work order, and it can look at the booking status on the elapsed time on the booking resource to see exactly how long that process took place. So it does give you a couple of different options for calculating how that information is going to work. Now, obviously, products are going to work kind of in conjunction with price lists from an application standpoint. So let's go ahead and talk just a little bit about price lists in the next aspect of this. From a price listing perspective, price lists really aren't that different in field service than they are from a Dynamics 365 perspective. They just define the different pricing levels on how you're going to sell and facilitate your different products within the application. So the concepts aren't any different. It still uses the same price list and product catalog that you would use from a Dynamics 365 implementation. The nice thing about price lists is price lists are noted specifically on the account that you're working with inside field service, any work orders that you're working with, agreements, or even just individual products and or services that you might be providing. So you can associate price lists with a few different areas, which will make automating some of these individual items inside the application much, much easier. Now, when you start talking about price lists, as we talked about, there's a few different types of options available. So you can have different price lists for obviously the same products and services, because depending upon who that customer is and what type of agreements that you might have in place with that customer, I may go in and I may charge obviously different prices for different situations. Now, when we start talking about products and services, there's a few different options that are available to you from a pricing perspective. Obviously, the first option from a product perspective is, this is what we're going to charge you. There's a specified amount that you're going to use to associate that with that individual product. But you also have your percent markup options. So you can go in on a price list and you can associate it with a percent markup of the actual price of the item that you're working with or the cost of the item, as well as a percent margin. So you can determine what specific options you want to do within those items. Same thing with services. Services allow you to actually go in and do specific amounts, percent markups, and percent of margins. But in addition to that, you also have the capability when you start talking about services to actually do kind of minimum charge amounts, minimum charge durations, or even just flat fees if you wanted to from an application standpoint. So think about it from a product perspective. Minimum charge amount. If you're going to sell out and I'm going to send somebody out on site, and we know that, you know, typically it's going to take 45 minutes, but there are some situations where people can go in and out of that particular customer site in 15 minutes, I can set that to just say, you know, no matter what they go out and do it, it's going to be, you know, $150 or $250. And then when that ticket is, or that work order is actually billed, that value is added to the final price, regardless of what the amount was that was charged for those individual situations. It says, here's what the minimum was, here's what's going to be charged from that standpoint. The other option that you can do is you could have kind of a minimum charge duration. And you could say, okay, here's kind of the minimum charge duration. And if you wanted to, within that minimum charge duration, you could actually reflect that, okay, the first X amount of time for that option is going to be free, and then we're going to work on from this situation. Or if it's just, this is what we charge, you could have a flat fee option that would be associated with some of those different services that would be brought out into that situation. So it gives you kind of a flexible pricing option based upon what specific needs and requirements you might have inside the application. So let's go ahead and just hop into the application and look at some of these products and price lists and see how they all kind of affine together as we're working through. One of the things they've done within the Field Service Administration is they've given you access to price lists and products directly through the Field Service Administration screen. It's still going to take you into the same product catalog area that you would have inside the actual application, but you just now can access it directly from the Field Service Administration. So when I go in and I click on products, this is going to take me right into my product catalog. That's going to show me the same product structures that you would have inside your Dynamics 365 implementation. So I can see individualized products, I can see product bundles, I can see product families, and I can see statuses of all of those individual items, just like if I was working with the aspect of the application itself. As you're working through these, now you can start to see what specific items, you know, might make up these individual situations that you're working with. So this is where you can go in and look at individual items. So for example, one of the options that we have is replace standard 120 volt receptacle. I'm going to go ahead and open this up. So within the product itself, I have all the same capabilities that you would have inside the product catalog. You'll have your name, you'll have your product ID, you can associate it with your family hierarchy. If you wanted to have, you know, individual kind of options available as to when it's, you know, when it's available, you could do that. You still have your unit groups, your default unit groups, but then you also can work with your default kind of list price options that you might have in these individual scenarios. As you move down towards the bottom, you will start to see some different options specifically around field service. And so this is where that inventory, non-inventory service type situation comes into play. And so one of the things that you'll see in here is once I choose service, I'm going to have different options available based upon what it is that I'm working with. When I start talking about adding it as an inventory item or a non-inventory item, then I have the capabilities to fill in things, you know, around, do I convert it to a customer asset? So if it's an inventory item, if it's, for example, a printer that I'm putting in place, once I put that in and I close that work order, would I like the system to automatically convert that into a customer asset? So now I have that customer asset in the system, so I can go back and take a look at that at moving forward. And if it happens to be a smart device, I could maybe potentially use some of the connected field service options to be able to monitor that particular option moving forward and seeing what's happening. From an accounting perspective, I can also look at, you know, whether or not it's taxable. So this is where I can set up different tax rates based upon the items that I want to work with. So in here, if I set this to a taxable based item, I can define what type of tax option I want to use, and if it's going to be a percentage of the total cost, we can define some of those individual tax rates as we're moving forward. So these are where you would set up the specific products that are going to support your field service implementation. Now, as those products are created, then each one of those products products can then be associated with specific price lists. So inside the application, now you can go back into your administrative area, and then within your administrative area, you can go into price lists, and that's where we can open up the specific price list that we want to work with inside the application. I go back into my price list, and so here I can see these are price lists that are already kind of established for what it is that I want to work with. But this is where now I can open up this individualized price list, and this is where I can start associating those specific products with those individual price lists. Now, as we go into the application and we start talking about work orders and we start talking about accounts, we'll show you specifically where on those individualized records you can start to define the specific price lists that are going to be used for those options. But this is where now I can start adding individual options as price lists items to this particular option. So now I could come into my price list item, I could pick whatever specific product I would want to use for that price list item inside the application itself, define what that option might be. So in this case, let's go ahead and use that replace option. And we'll replace our receptacle. We'll add it in. This is where I can now kind of define how I want to use my pricing methods. So these are where I have my different options if I want to do kind of my percent of list, my percent markup based upon current cost or standard cost. And then this is where I can define kind of what specific situation I want to do on that item. So in this case, we'll say it's maybe $750. And then as I'm moving forward, as I've added this individual item in, I can hit save and close. And then this is where I can start, again, defining how this information is going to be reflected in the application. So this would be the next piece to this, because now you can start adding these individual products specifically to these work orders as you're moving forward. Now, before we wrap this up, there's just a couple of things that I want to draw your attention to as part of the application. Oftentimes you are going to run into situations where you might have a price list that's associated with a specific work order. In those situations, when you have a price list attached to a work order, if the product that is coming into that price list has a different default price list than the work order price list is what is going to be used. So that product is, if that product is associated with that work order, but it has a different default price list, it's still going to use the work order price list from that option. If the price of the product is actually coming from a situation that is not on that work order price list, so if you're adding a product that is not necessarily on that work order price list, then it's going to look at the price list that that work order item or that a product item is associated with, and it's going to add that in. So you do want to look at those particular items when you're adding products in and understanding what product price list those particular products are associated with, because that will have an impact as to what's being displayed inside the application itself. And then again, obviously you do want to go in and make sure that whatever products and or services that you are going to facilitate, that they are added to the appropriate price list, because now you have the capabilities. Once you've done that, you can now go in and start to associate those specific products and services to the incident types inside the application when you add those items to work orders, and it will just make the streamlining of the process much more effective. Ultimately, the people or the items that are going to be carrying out these work orders are going to be resources. And a resource could be any number of different things when you think about it from a field service perspective. Could be a specific user inside the application. Could be a piece of equipment that is used to go out and do and provide that particular service. Could be account, maybe a contact. Could be maybe a third-party person coming in and that contracts with you and your organization. Regardless of what the situation is, the bookable resources are the items that are ultimately going to get associated with work orders when we schedule and create these bookings. And so from an application perspective, there's a lot of different things that you can do around these individual bookable resources to define more specific details about them, who they are, where they're available, what time zone they're in, what their cost is from an hourly perspective. These are all items that can come into it. So what I want to do now is I want to take you back into the application, and I want to look at this concept of resources and talk just a little bit about how resources work from within the app itself. So there's a couple of different options available when we start talking about working with resources and individual situations. The first thing that you'll notice if we go up into field service, obviously we can go into administration and we can add access it and work with it through administration. But there's also this concept around what is called resource scheduling. And so one of the things that the new field service interface allows you to do is it does support the availability to be able to do what's called unified scheduling, where you can actually schedule other items outside of just work orders inside using the schedule board calendar. Now, this isn't necessarily something we'll get into a lot of detail on this particular module. We'll touch on it in another module. But for example, if you wanted to, schedule opportunities or you wanted to schedule service activities, you could actually enable those individual items for use as part of the unified scheduling option and use the resource scheduling to be able to work through that. And so when you start talking about resource scheduling, that's where you get into things like booking statuses and administrations and different things. But there's also this concept of what are called resource roles and resource skills and proficiency models. These are all things that are used to support an individual resource inside the application. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to go in and look at some of these individual resources, and then we'll talk a little bit about how some of these items coordinate together. So as you can see in the sample data that we have here, there's a lot of resources or bookable resources that have been created in the system here, and these are all just contact records that have been added in. So a resource can be any number of different situations. When you go in to create a new resource inside field service, you're going to click on New, and it's going to open up the resource creation screen. So you'll see there's a couple of different options that you can do. Now, what's cool about field service in the resource options is it actually shares the resource options with project service automation. And so if you're ever using that particular solution, the resources, the skill sets, the characteristics, the categories, all of those baseline information are actually shared in conjunction with project service automation. So that's why you might see situations in here such as generic, resource group. Those are items that typically get used primarily within project service automation, but obviously do play some bit of a factor coming into what you might do from a field service perspective. Now, depending upon what you choose. So for example, if I'm going to create a new resource type that's going to be a user, my fields are going to change a little bit. So depending upon what I've chosen here, it's going to associate it with different records inside the application. So we've got different business rules that display different options. So in this case, if this is a user, this is going to allow me to associate this with a specific user account in the application. So I'll just go ahead and associate this with my particular user account. Then I can come into here and I can define what time zone I'm coming out of. So from a scheduling perspective, this is where I can go in and specify, okay, Derek works out of this physical location. This is the time zone that he'll be working out of, so it takes that into account as it's building and defining some of the individual schedule pieces. Now, if I scroll down, I'll see that there is some different common options that are associated with it. So one of the things that each individual item can have is kind of an organizational unit. An organizational unit would represent kind of the different elements of your business that you might be working with. They're very different from a business unit perspective, where business unit are defined for kind of your hierarchy security within the application and your boundaries for security. Organizational units might define some of the different elements that you work with. So for example, this is the company we're working through as Contoso. Contoso has different options. We have Contoso France that has different people that are working and working with it. We have India, we have UK. In this case, we also have Redmond, which is one of the main areas where we're going to be working with and providing services out of. Now, one of the other options that you'll see in here is the starting and ending location. So one of the things that you can do within these starting and ending locations is this is where you can have the schedule board look at who this individual person is and where this person is to take into consideration from a scheduling standpoint. So you can have it default to using the address of the company that they're currently servicing, or you can have it use kind of the resource address. You can also leave it empty, and then it will just kind of take into account some of the different location-based information that they're working with. Now, depending upon who I am and where I'm working with it, I might also have kind of my scheduling option. So I'm ultimately somebody who's going to be scheduled within the context of this application. So do I want this person to show up on the schedule board as a resource that we can pick? And do I want this person to be available when we're doing searches? So do I want to be able to use kind of the scheduling assistant options for searching for this person as I'm working through it? Do I want to use warehouse options? So what warehouse would I primarily be working out of? So maybe this is a person where I'm actually physically driving a truck and I always drive truck number 10. Well, if I set up and define a truck as a warehouse within the application, now I can associate this with my truck. So now I know that this is the truck or the inventory location that Derek bases a lot of his information off of. So it takes that into consideration as it's moving forward. Drip scheduling is a feature that allows you to not necessarily let the technicians see everything that is on their schedule. So one of the things that the drip scheduling does is it only gives you the next available appointment that you have to be scheduled for from an application standpoint, as opposed to giving you all of them, because there's an option to approve and reject individual options depending upon the item that you're working with. And drip scheduling basically says, I'm only going to show you what's next on your list of situations, so you can't necessarily look forward and cherry pick specific things based upon your options. Now, the other thing is, if I'm going to take time off, or if I'm not going to be involved in this particular situation anymore, I also have the option in here where I can recommend specific time off options and determine whether or not I need to be approved from a time off standpoint. Now, once I've saved this resource, so I've got the generalized information for my resource that I want to work with, now I can go in and I can start assigning this resource different characteristics and different categories. Now, again, we've talked quite a bit about characteristics as we've moved forward, and the fact that these are used to more target define what it is that you want to do from a scheduling standpoint. But the nice thing about characteristics as well is when they show up on the scheduling board, you can actually see who that person is based upon those individualized characteristics. So for example, I can go into here and I can add a characteristic, and I'm going to say, okay, Derek has a specific skill set. So what is the characteristic that I want Derek to have? So in this case, we're just going to say CRM. And now I have a proficiency model. So this is that proficiency model that we talked about. Now, this is a customizable option inside your resource option. So you can go into your proficiency models and you can define what specific proficiency model you want to use as part of this situation. But I can say that Derek is, fairly proficient with, or is very proficient with Microsoft Dynamics CRM. I can hit save and close, and now it will add that particular characteristic to my subset. Now, if I wanted to add another one, I could go in and I could add another one based upon what that particular item might be, define what that proficiency option is for that individual scenario, and continue to kind of build these individual situations as I'm moving forward. So again, these would all be baseline consideration things that would be taken into account for me as people are getting ready to schedule me. Now, at the same point, I might have a category that's associated with me. So depending upon who I am or what type of functionality that I would have, I could come into here in my categories and I could see, okay, what type of situations do I have? Am I a developer? Am I an architect? Am I a functional consultant? This is where now I could go in and define what those individual categories are from inside the application. Well, I'm a technician, so I'm going to go ahead and add technician as my option, and then save and close. And just like anything, I could have multiple options associated with this. Maybe in addition to being a technician, I am also an architect, and I could add architect. So you can have multiple categories and multiple characteristics associated with this individual resource as you're moving forward. Now, in addition to this, once the actual person has been defined, the next thing that you can look at is you can start defining specific things around like their working hours. And so this would be a situation where I could define what my schedule looks like from a technician perspective, and this is what's going to be taken into account when it determines how to schedule me inside the application. So this is where I can look at my individualized schedule. I can define if I want to set up kind of a new work schedule for a day. If I want to define a new weekly schedule, this is where I can set up kind of my individual schedule. And then it uses just my standard scheduling options inside the application if you've ever defined working hours within the application. Now again, you'll notice that there's an option here for business closures. So again, you will have to take into consideration whether or not this person is observing business closures as part of their schedule. So do you have holidays off within those items, and does that take into account when people are working through things? By default, nobody will observe business closures unless you specify it inside their situation. So I know that from an application standpoint, we'll just say that I work from 8 to 5, and I work from 8 to 5 Monday through Friday, and we'll start it as of today, and then save and close. And so these are items that, from a resource perspective, help you better target what's happening. So as you're setting up these resources, the next thing that you want to define is what specific hours that resource is going to work, so that can transfer over from a scheduling standpoint. As you start working through this, now we also can keep track of time off requests, assuming that we've had to request approval for time off request standpoints. But this is also where we can start to see the individualized booking options that are available for me as we're going through. So this needs to be done for each individualized resource that you might be using as you're working forward and building and designing the application. Now, the final piece to this from a resources perspective, if I go back into field service and administration, is you also have the capabilities to define what those categories are. So we talked a little bit about characteristics earlier. This is where we could set up the actual characteristics that we would have for the organization. This is where we can also set up our specific categories. So if you want to add or customize individual categories that I could use and select from that drop-down menu, this is where you could add a new resource category, just define what the category name is for the item that we're working with. We'll just call this sample manager, save and close, and then work from there. The other option that you also have in here are pay types. So again, you have to look at, from a resource perspective, as you're going through, what are some of the different pay types that are associated with these options. So when a work order is created and it's being done over break time or it's being done over overtime scenarios, what is the hourly rate that we're going to charge based upon those items? So when we actually physically build the work orders inside the application, we can define these. So you do need to look at the different pay types that are associated with these items as you're building these up, because these will drastically also include what's happening as part of the application itself. As you can see, deploying field service is a lot more than just using the specific functionality that's built into the application. You really need to have a good, solid understanding of what your organization's intent on using the application is for. That way you can better define what settings are going to be a part of that application itself. And so you really want to understand things like, how do you define your product and pricing structure? What specific products and or services are going to be associated with these individualized work orders that you're going to be working with? And how are you going to price those based upon whether or not they are associated with an account in the application, whether they are associated with a work order or other individualized options. The other thing that you want to keep in mind is, how are you going to handle your resources? So from a resource perspective, who are your individualized resources? Are they going to be mapped back to individualized users within the application? Are they going to be mapped to accounts or contacts based upon what it is that you're doing? Are they pieces of equipment? What characteristics or skill sets do each one of those resources have that will help better define how that resource can be utilized within the application? When is that resource available? Does that resource have a very fixed working hour scenario that they're going through, or do they have a specific schedule that you want to define for those resources based upon what you're working with? And then the other thing that you want to consider is territories. How do territories fit into what you're doing? Because from a territory perspective, if you start associating territories with different account records and items within the application, you now have the ability to be able to filter information down to make it much easier to find that information as you're working through and trying to find that information on the schedule board. So these are all individualized system settings that it's very important that you do set up and configure ahead of time, because it will make moving forward with the application much, much easier.